Hello gamers, welcome back to the channel. Today we are talking about something truly special, the art of Age of Empires. The legendary franchise that has been conquering our hearts for an incredible 27 years. Can you believe it? This isn't just any game series. We are talking about the crown jewel of real-time strategy that stayed at the top of the charts for nearly 3 decades. Back when most strategy games were either turn-based or set in fantasy realms with dragons and orcs, Age of Empires burst into the scene with something completely different. It brought us real-time battles and fights and real human history. And oh my god, let's talk about the visuals, the art. While other games in the early 90s were sticking to the typical traditional pixel-based art, which we love, by the way, don't get me wrong, it is beautiful, there's a charm to it. Age of Empires came looking like $1,000,000 with its pre-rendered 3D sprites. It was like jumping from black and white TV straight to HD. Okay, maybe not that much, but you get me, you know what I mean. So get your favorite beverage, coffee or soda, get comfortable and join me in this amazing journey through time. We are about to explore the art evolution of Age of Empires from 1 to 4 and how it changed the following technology advancements and player preferences. So let's start where everything began, Age of Empires 1. In the mid-1990s, the strategy game landscape was dominated by turn-based giants like Civilization, and the rising wave of RTS games or real-time strategy games were led by Warcraft and Command & Conquer. But Bruce Shelley, co-designer of Civilization, saw an opportunity to bring something fresh into the genre, an RTS that combined the strategic depth of Civilization with fast, action-packed real-time battles. This vision led to the birth of Age of Empires, a game that would not only carve out its own place in gaming history, but also lay the foundation for one of the most beloved strategy franchises of all time. And oh my god, that intro! It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen running on a computer. At the heart of Age of Empires was Ensemble Studios, a small Texas-based development team led by Tony Goodman. Unlike its competitors, which would focus more on futuristic and fantasy settings, Age of Empires took players on a journey through real-world history, spanning from the Stone Age to the Iron Age. The game introduced a compelling mix of resource management, technology progression, and military conquest, making players feel like they were guiding an ancient civilization themselves towards greatness. When Age of Empires was launched in 1997, it was an instant success. But hardware was still relatively limited at the time. I mean, at CPU power, graphics processing, memory, and storage, for example. And Ensemble Studios had to work with these limitations to make sure that the game, Age of Empires, would run smoothly on the average computer at the time. As an RTS, AoE required real-time calculations for unit movement, combat decisions, and economy management. The AI was limited to scripted behaviors, rather than advanced decision-making. And still, the game's performance would drop drastically in huge battles with hundreds of units. And that forced developers to limit the population cap. Unlike today, GPUs were not common back in 97, and most PCs relied on software rendering, meaning the CPU handled graphics processing instead of offloading it to a GPU. 3D rendering was extremely demanding at the time, and most 3D games were usually pixelated, lacked details, and suffered a lot from low frame rates. Rendering complex scenes in real time required a lot of processing power and memory, something most of the computers at the time just didn't have. At the same time, we have consoles like Nintendo 64 coming out and bringing the 3D gaming experience into people's homes. Suddenly, 2D wasn't cool anymore and 3D was the new thing. But that didn't stop developers from innovating and trying to bring that 3D experience to the PC. So how do you offer 3D rendered graphics if your customers cannot render 3D graphics? Developers thought of a solution for that. They could create these highly detailed environments, characters, and objects, render themselves on their powerful computers, and get 2D static images of them or a sequence of images forming an animation or like a little movie. And despite being static in nature, this would create the illusion of depth and three-dimensionality through shading and lighting. And since no rendering was required, developers could pack them with far more detail than their 3D counterparts. This particular art style was mostly seen in RPGs, strategy, and management games at the time, but they were not extremely common. It was just something that just came out, something the developers were just starting to try out. This technique, however, was mostly abandoned by the mid-2000s. You would still find a game here and there still using that art style, but by the end of 2004, this technique was mostly obsolete. So the first Age of Empires game uses exactly this technique. The game uses pre-rendered 3D sprites paired with an isometric perspective, where units and buildings were modeled in 3D first and then converted into flat 2D images with pre-rendered lighting and shading to simulate depth without requiring real-time dynamic lighting. 2D sprites, however, of course, means that the units cannot rotate 360, and instead they can only turn in 8 different directions. And on top of that, the animations had no transition, so units would either just stand around or be doing something immediately. They don't have that flexibility of switching animations with some motion. However, the sprites allowed for high detail while keeping the performances stable. Most PCs in 1997 had 2 to 4 megabytes of video memory, so the color palette had to be restricted, allowing the fast rendering of textures. To be more specific, they used a 8-bit color palette, limited to 256 colors. With that, they were able to reduce the memory load. To bring a dark, ancient immersion, developers chose to follow some warm and earthy tones, such as brown, faded blues, and dull greens. Low saturation was used to maintain realism and readability, keeping colors muted but distinct. And for the terrain, sandstone and grass textures use some blended gradients instead of sharp contrast. Artists, actually, they were inspired by ancient frescoes and mosaics, which naturally have faded and sun-worn colors when creating their assets. Since Age of Empires ran in 256 color mode, every sprite had to fit within a limited color palette. So how did they make everything look so good? Well, the game used a trick called color quantization. Basically, it takes the thousands of colors from the original 3D renders, from 3D Studio Max for example, and squeeze them down into just 256 colors. And to make shading and lighting effects look smoother, they used a technique called dithering, which blends different color pixels to create the illusion of gradients. Certain parts of the unit, however, of the unit's texture, like banners and shields, they were assigned a special color that could be swapped out depending on which player controlled them. That's how the game allowed multiple armies to be visually distinct without having to create separate sprites for each faction. Now, regarding performance, the sprites were firstly compressed using a technique called run length encoding. Instead of storing every single pixel separately, it grouped identical pixels together, which saved memory and helped the game run smoothly on low-end PCs. And second, they didn't use real-time lighting as we mentioned. That would have been way too demanding. Instead, Shadows and highlights were baked directly into the sprite textures, making them look three-dimensional without any extra processing power. So when Bruce Shelley said, "The sun always shines in Age of Empires," he wasn't just talking about the game's atmosphere. He meant that they had carefully crafted the art style to be bright, readable, and efficient, even with the hardware limitations of the time. Age of Empires also brought this blend of macro and micro management, meaning economic management and units management. And this completely set the game apart from its competitors already. But not only that, the game gave emphasis to history. And many parents reported that Age of Empires motivated their children to study history and different cultures. And Bill Gates even promoted the game as an educational software. We can of course oversee the fact that the game leaves blood and bones rotting on the ground, right? In 1999, only 2 years later, Age of Empires 2 was launched. And during this time, only these 2 years, there were already advancements in technology. The 2D pre-rendered sprites were still used. However, more resolution was already possible. And with more resolution, you have more pixels on the screen that you can fill with more colors, more information, and more details. Animations also, the little movies that we talked about, the sequence of snapshots of that 3D model, they could be smoother because more frames could be added to those animations. And while AoE 1 was limited to this 8-bit palette for colors, AoE 2 now can go up to the 16-bit palette, allowing smoother gradients and also improved contrast between the units, the terrain, and the buildings. And a new unit was added to the game, the female villager. It's important to keep in mind that both games, they aim for reality in a way. They want to represent history, they want to represent things as they were, as they are. But still, Age of Empires 1 was still taking into consideration a more stylized looks to the game. To the buildings, for example, are simpler, they are small, they don't have the proper proportions. The units are way bigger than the buildings. But AoE 2, with more capabilities and more accessibility in hardware and processing, it aims more into a realistic proportion regarding buildings and unit size. The trees, the buildings, they all have this perspective, this proportion more calculated to look realistic. With more details and with this proportion added to the game, however, also causes problem regarding readability of the game itself. Now more elements were added to the terrain, to the environment, to the trees. Everything looks nice, as nice as it could at the time, but it gives so much information that if you think at a more competitive level, it can be more challenging to identify what's going on. It's not really intuitive. And that's one of the reasons that nowadays Age of Empires 2 is played almost 100% of the time with mods. So for example, the trees, they block so much the vision in the game that nowadays in esports, mods are used to make the trees look smaller. And there are thousands of mods for Age of Empires 2, by the way, thousands of them. Even for hiding structures when the building is being constructed, to making other vegetations disappear from the land, from the terrain, and so on. You can check it out for yourself. There are thousands of them to try to tweak how the game looks, to make it feel more easy to play and to find your units and to read all the information that you have on your screen.
Why do you like cube mod? Because I see everything as cubes in real life too.
AoE 2 also, instead of representing the ancient era as like AoE 1, now focus more on the medieval period. Here, game artists used medieval tapestries for inspiration, making use of bright and vibrant colors. The terrain is simple like in the first game, but in the definitive edition, details were added to the ground such as leaves, bushes, and even sand grain. You can notice, especially in the definitive edition, how colors are not shy at all. Water, for example, in the original version, has a very intense, deep blue color, and in the definitive edition, it's extremely bright. And the campaign illustrations, like the ones in Jeanne d'Arc's campaigns, they have a painted, aged parchment look inspired by medieval manuscripts. But in general, we just see a clear improvement regarding textures, details, animations, even diversity of fauna and flora in the game. But still, the changes between AoE 1 and 2 are more like a refinement instead of a reinvention. Now we see the greatest shift regarding performance and graphics in the whole franchise. The leap from Age of Empires 2 to Age of Mythology was massive in terms of technology, graphics, and art style. Age of Mythology, launched in 2005, was the first game in the franchise to use a fully 3D engine. This engine was the Bang engine, and it was like a modified and enhanced version of the Genie engine that was used before for Age of Empires 1 and 2. But since it was just an enhanced version, it only allowed some limited improvements, such as low poly models. But still, even though it was 3D, lighting was very simplified, shadows were still baked, and it appears like a black blob beneath the units. And the destruction, for example, of buildings and structures were still just an animation instead of physics driven. But I really don't want to focus too much on Age of Mythology, which is considered a spin-off of the Age of franchise. The developers at that point, they wanted to give the fans something new that would be a refresh from the historical games, so they decided to go with some mythology.
And we thought we'd give the historical games a rest and come out with something really new for our fans.
But I just want to point it out that it's a more complex game. It's the first officially 3D game in the series. It brings more vibrant colors, more rich environments, and gods and powers that demand some kind of bloom and shine, and it's a different vibe from the historical games, which I want to focus more. However, what I want to point out bringing Age of Mythology is that for the first time, the game starts to have real music implemented in the game. And what do I mean by that? I mean that before Age of Mythology, the music, the soundtracks in the game, they were created using synthesizers and keyboards. They were pretty simple, and now with Age of Mythology, they brought in real instruments to the studio to record those sounds. And although it's not specifically graphic, I think I can consider the music and the sounds in game also a type of art. It's still art, and I wanted to mention that this is the turning point for music in Age of Empires. So we have Age of Mythology launching in 2002, and then Age of Empires 3 comes in 2005. AoE3, just like AOM, was built on the Bang engine, but now with Havoc Physics. Havoc Physics is a software development kit, and it allows game developers to simulate physics in their games, like collisions, cloth simulation, and even ragdoll effects. In a way, Havoc Physics made AoE3 possible. The art style draws from baroque and colonial era paintings, leading to a more realistic color palette, something that we saw in the first Age of Empires game. The definitive edition came out in 2020, and of course we see a drastic improvement. The assets don't have to be low poly any longer, and I think developers had the time of their lives redesigning this game to look even more impressive. Age of Empires 3 was developed to push the systems, the computers at the time, to their limits. And that is because at this point in time, it's getting easier and easier to have a high-end computer at home. With that, they want to push for reality as much as they can. So you don't see exaggeration in the units, how they look like, the proportions are also realistic. And they did such a great job that the game actually got so many awards for the beautiful game, the most beautiful RTS ever, so many prizes for the looks of the game. In any case, AoE3 was one of the most visually advanced RTS games of its time, pushing the limits of what was possible in a strategy game. There are two types of players in RTS: casuals and competitive players. Age of Empires 3 did a great job at visuals and attracted many casual players. However, the addition of so much information to the game hurts the competitive scene. Balancing and gameplay readability are essential in a competitive game. Well, after 15 years without a new game being released in the franchise, Age of Empires 4 was announced in 2017 and released in 2021. This time, learning from the previous games that they have already launched and created, they aimed for something a little bit different this time. AoE4 follows a more stylized art direction than any of the previous games. And we have to remember that in 15 years, way more than technology changed. The RTS genre itself also changed a lot, and how players interact with the game and what they want and what they don't want anymore. And to be honest, between 2005 and 2021, the RTS genre itself just lost its dominance, with very few high-budget releases. Many RTS franchises, such as StarCraft II, Total War, Company of Heroes, and Age of Empires 3, proved that the hyper-realistic graphics could sometimes hurt the gameplay readability.
Because for some reason, I find that both the army models and the city models are extremely hard to point out and differentiate from the map in a normal way.
And because of all that, AoE4 went for this stylized realism. Unlike AoE3, AoE4 ensured that units and buildings remained clear and easily readable even when zoomed out on a different resolution. For example, weapons in Age of Empires 4 are way bigger than they realistically would be. So you see those big spears being carried around, or lances being carried by the knights, that they are huge, but that means you can easily identify if that's a knight or if that's a horseman. The motions and the animations of the units were also exaggerated to make sure that with the movement of the unit, you recognize what they are supposed to do, what are they supposed to be. And that actually is an inspiration that they took from MOBA. When RTS games were going down in the charts of player base, MOBAs were going up, like Dota, like League of Legends, for example. So the idea of having units a little bit tankier, easier to click and easier to recognize fast and to move them around comes from a little bit of inspiration from the MOBA. Now, the artistic style of Age of Empires 4 is inspired in medieval illuminated manuscripts, tapestries, and paintings. This is also one of the most distinct artistic choices that sets it apart from previous games. And in medieval artwork, important figures were often depicted larger than others to indicate importance rather than realism. And this concept is called hierarchical scale. In AoE4, the buildings are only slightly larger relative to units. And the units, as I mentioned, they are exaggerated for clarity, for readability, gameplay readability. Unlike, for example, Renaissance paintings that focused on this realistic depth and perspective, medieval art often relied on flattened scenes, making elements more clearly readable. They couldn't afford even the paint, the paint were so expensive, they couldn't afford that many details. So they had to over-exaggerate some elements in order to make it clear what it was. One of the most fascinating things about Age of Empires 4's art style is how it balances detail and simplicity to create a beautiful and readable world. And they did this in a really smart way. See, when you look at the game, some areas like tree canopies, rocks and cliffs, it looks rich and textured and full of life. But then if you look at the open fields like beaches or water, they are much simpler, way smoother, and that's intentional. Instead of relying on tons of tiny details or harsh shadows, the artists used micro-hue shifts, meaning subtle changes in color, in order to create some depth and texture. Think of it like painting a tree. Instead of drawing every single leaf, you use different shades of green to suggest the leaves. It looks detailed, but it's actually pretty simple. Now here's where it gets even cooler. The whole game was painted in a style called alla prima, which is a fancy way of saying they use pure colors instead of layering or blending them too much. It's like using bold, confident brushstrokes instead of slowly building up shadows and fades. And that gives the game this painterly, handcrafted feel, like something straight out of a medieval tapestry. This approach makes AoE4's world look alive, while still being super clear and easy to read. It's not trying to be ultra realistic like Age of Empires 3, but instead it embraces history in its own way, like a piece of medieval art brought to life. And that's the magic of AoE4's art. It's a balance of beauty, clarity, and history. And now that you know all this, you will never look at the game the same way again. I know I won't. Another example of this inspiration in medieval art is the intricate borders and stylized patterns in the UI itself. Anyway, another example, the mines. And that's a very hot topic. Many people really dislike how gold mines and stone mines look like in AoE4, and I completely understand. They are very stylized. They are not supposed to look real. They are supposed to be easy for you to identify that this is gold and this is stone. You don't have to look twice. You know what it is. Alright guys, what an incredible journey we just took throughout history. From those humble beginnings with pixelated sprites to the stunning visuals that we see today, this series has come such a long way, isn't it? But that's it, we reach here the end of our artistic journey in Age of Empires. I really hope you enjoyed. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the gaming history, you know what to do. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button to let me know that you enjoyed. Drop your thoughts in the comments down below. I would love to hear which art style from which game is your favorite. And I see you guys in the next one. Keep gaming, stay awesome. See you guys. Bye.